Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be a conversation about the Bill Clinton presidency. Bill Clinton is perhaps best remembered for transforming the Democratic Party to align itself with corporate America, and by the end of his presidency, governing that way, though of course Bill Clinton will also be remembered for being impeached and for his affair with White House aide Monica Lewinsky. More consequential to the country were his policies that included welfare reform, tough on crime laws, repealing the GlassSteagall Act, which many argue helped bring the Great Recession a decade later, and for the free trade deal known as NAFTA, as well as expanding the WTO. My guest today argues that Bill Clinton didn't enter office with these as his main goals, but instead he sought to transform the American economy into one that helped everyday people, and not necessarily with the agenda to move the country towards neoliberalism, even though that's what ended up happening. My guest to talk about this transformation is Nelson Lichtenstein. Nelson Lichtenstein is a research professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he is the author of the book that he joins us to talk about called A Fabulous Failure, the Clinton Presidency and the Transformation of American Capitalism. It is written with the late Judith Stein. Nelson Lichtenstein, it is a good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
I was old enough to vote for the first time in 1992 and voted for Bill Clinton, and I was still a young man when he left office at the very beginning of 2001. And I remember how popular Bill Clinton was at that time when he left office. And I was still a young man then, but I thought to myself, wow, this guy's going to be remembered as one of the great presidents. However, historiography is a funny thing. That's how one generation tells the story compared to another generation when we talk about history. And it turns out now, 22 years later, his legacy isn't as shining as I, as a young man, once thought. We're even finding Democratic politicians who are running for president trying to distance themselves from Bill Clinton.
Yes, you're certainly right about that, and I touch on sort of why that the rapid decline in his reputation. I do think for contemporary progressives, the point of the book to understand is that it's not enough merely to have some good progressive ideas to put forward. In your whenever whether you're elected at either local, national, whatever office or just a social movement, it's not enough just simply to have these ideas. You have to understand the structure of power, who your opponents were, and how you're going to either defeat them or co-opt them or something of that sort. And so the point about the book is, it's not an apology in any way for Bill Clinton. It's to understand that he came into office. He had a cohort of people with him who did have roughly progressive ideas, some of which are kind of Biden is beginning is deploying. But those he was defeated. It's a fabulous failure. He was defeated because I don't think the Clintonites and the progressive Clintonites as well sort of understood who their enemies were, who their opponents were, and how they to be countered. Plus, of course, Bill Clinton brought into office also a cohort of people who would be defined. I think we would define them, overused term, but nevertheless as neoliberals. But I want to make clear about neoliberalism. It's not simply capitalists with top hats. Many neoliberals were welfare state advocates. Robert Rubin, the most important figure in the Clinton administration, Secretary of Treasury, was a liberal. He voted for and raised money for George McGovern in '72, and he certainly did a lot for Clinton as well. But and he was a racial liberal, etc. But he was his economic ideas, his commitment to the liquidity and mobility of capital, his interest in the deregulation of finance. All of this was in contradiction and ultimately destructive of any of his welfare state or liberal ideas. So I want to make that point. I think that's important to understand, because otherwise progressives just putting forth a good program today, if you don't understand what the structure of capitalism really is and how you're going to counter it, then you're going to find yourself, as Clinton did, with basically a ultimately a failure. And I mean, and his reputation. I mean, interesting. I'll talk about his reputation if you'd like. It didn't actually. You're right. It was not in the doghouse in the year 2000 or 2001 when he left office. Well, I'll just say it goes into the doghouse, and Hillary's too. uh, in 2015, when all Bernie has to do is say, "This is what I stand for." He didn't really attack Hillary in a kind of, vicious way. He just said, "This is what I stand for. I'm against the billionaire class. And who are you?" And that really made Bill Clinton and Hillary look bad, and they never really recovered.
That's interesting.
I mean,
So
Trump had something to do with it too, but
Yeah.
Bernie was, it.
So the shift really sort of hits hard in 2015, and then I would
Yeah,
argue reinforced,
before that.
even reinforced with the Me Too movement,
Yeah,
forced people to
right.
kind of re-examine that whole affair in the White House.
Well, Occupy was important. The Me Too movement, the whole, reanimation of the American left in various ways, and Trump himself, Trump, putting back on the table trade issues, things of that sort. Had something to do with it. But I mean, I would say that Bill, as late as 2012 at the Democratic Convention, Bill Clinton gives a spectacularly successful speech defending Obamacare, and he was applauded for that. And then Hillary was a fairly popular Secretary of State, at that time. So it really was only it was like a little later that her speeches before Goldman Sachs and such became an albatross around her neck. Yeah.
What did Bill Clinton campaign on in 1992?
Okay, good question. He did not campaign as a card-carrying loyal member of the Democratic Leadership Council, which was the kind of the right-wing political grouping that, I mean, it doesn't exist anymore, but it was powerful there. He was a member of it. He was president of it. But I would make the argument that he used them as much as they used him. What he did campaign on, it was a more progressive campaign than anyone since LBJ. And the Cold War was over, and one of his opponents, Paul Tsongas, made the comment: "The Cold War is over. Germany and Japan won." And Bill Clinton agreed with that. And what that meant was, there are other varieties of capitalism. There are other ways of reorganizing a capitalist society that are more successful. Yeah, we may have, the Soviet Union may have imploded and whatnot, but that didn't mean that American capitalism was triumphalist. Now, the Republicans had a kind of triumphalist view, but the Democrats did not, and Clinton did not. There were elements in the DLC, et cetera, who did, but he didn't. And he brought around him a number of people who were really in favor of what we call industrial policy. That is, managing and guiding the economy with various incentives, guidelines, payments, et cetera. Among them, Laura Tyson, who was the first head of the Council of Economic Advisors. She was a woman. That was unique. But what was really more important than the fact she was a woman was that she was a very unorthodox economist who beat out Larry Summers for head of the Council of Economic Advisors. That there would have been a real neoliberal, but he didn't make it. And also Paul Krugman, who at that time was not quite as liberal on many issues as he is today. So Laura Tyson, now she didn't do much when she got in, I have to say that, but nevertheless he chose her. And then he had around him people like Ira Magaziner, an old friend of Bill, he was a sort of a New Left figure who was seeking to revitalize American industry. He was a business consultant, but he was clearly on the left, and he was put in charge of the health reform, which Clinton saw, and Ira Magaziner and Hillary and others, as industrial policy. That is, that was the way it was put forward. If you want to remove a huge burden on American industry so it can compete with Germany and Japan and maintain jobs in the Midwest, we need to have a health reform. So there was a whole variety of things. Clinton didn't campaign on balancing the budget. That the slogan that Carville famously put on the war room of the Clinton election headquarters was the economy stupid. And what that meant was stay away from culture war issues. Don't get into that fight with George H.W. Bush or Pat Buchanan, and focus on reviving the American economy, and with a variety of programs. That was the slogan. And Clinton, I think that's where he went. Now, and they attempted to do that in the first 2 years of the administration. They made lots of mistakes, and we'll get to those. But he did. Just one more thing, when it comes to trade, and we'll talk about NAFTA, and China. But the other aspect of trade was in 1992 and 3 and 4 was Japan. And Japan was the second biggest economy in the world. And Japan was the economy that there were all these books written, about Japan as number one, and movies, and Japan was really a subject of kind of hysteria in the United States at that time. And the Clinton people sought to manage trade with Japan. They had debates with, and they came to the conclusion, the trade people, that Japan was not a capitalist economy like the U.S. It wasn't open. It was full of these, tight connections between banks and the government and the Ministry of Finance and industry. And the only way to penetrate that market was not with free market principles, but you had to have deals and hammer them out, in with the government and with the Ministry of Finance, and they tried to do that for a long time, and that was that I called my chapter on that a detour on the road to neoliberalism, because they thought Japan was not a free market economy. That would fail, and I'll get to that. I think the influence of Robert Rubin was important there, and I want to talk about him. But the first impulse of the Clinton period, the campaign in the first couple years, is not what we would call neoliberal. That was not the main thrust of it, I would say.
What was his healthcare reform plan?
Well, I think it was actually to the left of what Obama eventually put forward. It was the idea, he called it managed competition, but really it was more managed than competition. It entailed the creation of health purchasing alliances in every metropolitan area, and these would be under government guidance, a kind of groups of purchasers, and they would together collectively purchase insurance from the big insurance companies. Now, one of the big issues was that if these alliances were, covered 90% of all the purchasers of insurance, small business and medium-sized business and big business, then in effect they were setting prices. And although we think of the Clinton people as market oriented, et cetera, in fact the Congressional Budget Office and Hillary herself and Ira said, yes, ultimately we're going to create a system where we set the price and determine the character of the insurance. It's going to be as the head of the CBO put it, an exercise of sovereign power on the part of the state to do this. Now, this would get a lot of some businesses and insurance companies, pissed off about it. But the Clinton plan actually was, it mandated also that all big employers had to offer health insurance. It was actually to the left of what Obama ended up putting forward. Now,
did it have? Let me ask quickly though before we move on. Did it have something that would have resembled a public option or any element that would resemble single payer?
The answer is yes, in this sense that all of the purchasing alliances were essentially public. That is, they were under government supervision. They included 90% of everyone who was purchasing insurance, and that meant they were monopolies. They were monopsonies, and they would therefore have enormous market power. so much power that essentially they were the exercise again of sovereign state power. So it wasn't a question of an option; it was a question. The whole thing was statist. Now, this was not. It was not advertised this way, but this is what the way when you got into the details. This is what it was, and that's one reason that many of the big insurance companies bailed on the plan at the last minute. But I want to say, but one thing that Clinton thought, the reason Clinton thought the plan would carry through, would go through Congress, and even a section of the Republican Party thought it would go through, is that this plan was unquestionably in the interest of manufacturing, old line manufacturing, unionized manufacturing. It would help the Fords and Bethlehems and U.S. and steel companies and all of those who are being hammered by healthcare costs, where the Ford complained that they're spending more money on healthcare than steel, and it was totally in support. And so Clinton had those corporations on his side, very much so. And Ira Magaziner was constructively negotiating with the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers. They were helping to write the law. So Clinton thought that this was, he had this support among a slice of American capital. The problem was that capitalism was changing, and it was the Pepsi, the Walmarts, and the Pizza Huts, and the hotels, which were low wage, low benefit. They were booming, and they would become unalterably hostile to the plan. And so I think that was where I discussed that fight within various ranks of American capitalism as helping to doom the plan. Obama would learn a lot from Clinton, and basically he learned to cut a lot of deals and make sure they stuck before the law went to Congress. And under Obama, you had complete
that barely
Republican
got through.
opposition. What?
That barely got through. Obama's plan barely got through with major concessions.
Yes, well, right. What I'm going to say is you had complete Republican opposition to the plan, but it went through Congress because there were practically no Democratic defections, few of them. And why was that? Because all the big kind of corporatist players, the pharmacy, the insurance companies, big manufacturing, were all in favor of the plan. Even Walmart in 2010 was in favor of the plan because he structured it to be in the interests of those big corporations. So the Clinton plan was to the left of the Obama plan.
How close were they to getting Clinton's plan approved by Congress?
I think it was a close deal. As I said, Bob Dole, head of the titular head of the Republican Party, thought, well, we'll have some compromises, but it'll go through. He thought, yeah, it's going to happen. And there was tremendous, of course, public support for health reform in this period. It took kind of an act of insurgency on the part of Newt Gingrich, or at that time, Bill Kristol famously said, "We've got to smash the plan, because if Clinton wins this plan, then middle class Americans will see the government as on their side, and it'll be another iteration of the Great Society or the New Deal." So it required a kind of an insurgency in the Republican Party, and also a kind of coup d'etat within some of these business associations, like the Chamber, which was formally in favor of the plan, and there was a kind of a insurgency by so-called small business, and really what there was the fast food and other kinds of franchises, which in fact would have been really hurt by the plan, because they would have had to pay their fair share finally. So, so I'd spend 2 chapters on the plan, because I think it's sort of like an X-ray into the structures of American capitalism at this time. And the Clintonites sort of, they both got some things right and some things really wrong about that. That's what I mean about you have to know your enemy in order to be a successful reformer.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation about the Bill Clinton presidency. My guest is Nelson Lichtenstein, research professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and author of the book that he joins us to talk about, A Fabulous Failure, the Clinton Presidency and the Transformation of American Capitalism. It is written with the late Judith Stein. Let's take a step back before the Bill Clinton presidency and tell me about Bill Clinton in Arkansas, former governor of Arkansas, and the importance of Arkansas and sort of these early, more progressive ideas that he began with as president.
Right. I mean, he's an ambitious young guy. He was a he came out of age in the New Left, but he was not a real militant movement person. I mean, he was against the war in Vietnam in favor of racial justice. Racial justice was very important to him. Growing up in Arkansas, he identified with the civil rights movement. There's no doubt about that. And I think he'd memorized Martin Luther King's famous 1963 speech. So that was, important to him. But as a politician in Arkansas, he had to deal with the growing power of companies like Walmart and Tyson's Food and things of that sort. There was a fairly vigorous labor movement in Arkansas, but Clinton, as governor, he made a coldly calculating an opportunistic decision to simply marginalize labor and to some degree to demonize it. And, that's unforgivable. And I think this was a period when the labor movement was, especially in the 80s and 90s, was in the doldrums, at best, and both ideologically and in terms of its power. And Clinton, thought, okay, I can sort of ignore them. And that I think that's something that today President Biden has rejected. But in any event, as governor of Arkansas, he saw his main task as economic development. And he did want to reject the traditional Southern way of economic development, which was low wage, assembly, garment and textile plants that could be here today and gone tomorrow. And he was looking, or he went all around the world, northern Italy, Germany, Japan, you name it, looking for models of economic development, sometimes radical, sometimes more conservative. But that was what he was. That was his background. And so when he came into and he was, of course, in doing this, he had all sorts of people around him. Many of whom would later join the administration, thinking, if we try to do that in Arkansas, we can try to do that on a national scale. He was an opportunist. There's no doubt about it. I mean, of course, all American politicians who are successful are opportunists. And, the opportunism, could easily track to the right, and mainly did. But, occasionally he like on healthcare, he saw this as an issue. Hey, this is a popular issue. Let's go with it. And initially he did. Far more so than, say, balancing the budget, which was not part of a theme that he pushed in the 1992 campaign. It would later become important, but that was not what he pushed in that campaign.
I mean, he does move the very next year towards balancing the budget?
Yeah. I mean, what happens is that Ross Perot, who's a very important figure, emerges in the 1992 campaign and ends up with 19% of the vote. And Ross Perot, kind of made this point of balancing the budget a kind of almost fetish and was popular. And Clinton said, well, that's important. And then he was being told by his more conservative advisors, like Robert Rubin and Lloyd Benson, who was his Secretary of Treasury from Texas, and others, oh, you must balance the budget in order to keep interest rates down. At that time, there was a powerful argument, strong argument. I think it's wrong. It was sort of the so-called crowding out argument. That is, if the government borrows a lot of money, then private, industry won't be able to in order for it to borrow money, it'll have to pay higher interest rates. So interest rates will go up. So balancing the budget is essential to keep interest rates down, and that will then lead to investment. And so here are two models. Robert Reich, who had become Secretary of Labor today, kind of a radical, kind of he's a quite popular around the Bay Area and everywhere else. But in those days, it's much more of a moderate. Anyway, Robert Reich says we've got to have like $50 billion for stimulus to train people and reindustrialize. It wasn't very much money, compared to today, but still $50 billion to do good things, enhance the welfare state, etc. Robert Rubin comes along and says, $50 billion, that's nothing. If we lower interest rates, if we have balance the budget and lower interest rates, we'll get $1 trillion of new investment. And, that. Okay. So, but here's the problem. Reich wanted to target the $50 billion. He was an industrial a manager, an industrial policy kind of guy. Rubin, let the capitalist market decide. Well, that could be stock buyback, speculation, bubbles on Wall Street, which is what it was. And actually, I think Rubin was wrong. He was just empirically wrong about balancing budgets, creating low interest rates. But and he would later admit that. But that was the argument that the more conservative, the neoliberal wing of the Clinton administration, which won out, made in 1993 and later.
Are these the two opposing views and forces within the presidency, Robert Reich and Robert Rubin?
There were two different camps, and the Rubin wing wins out unquestionably. Larry Summers, Robert Rubin wing. Gene Sperling, in fact, was in that wing as well. They win out. They win a decisive victory, and by 1996, all of the so-called Clinton liberals are either out of office or marginalized, and they win. And they're again, you could say this was sort of overdetermined that they would win, but there was a battle that took place about it.
How significant?
I can give you another example.
Well, how significant is the defeat of the healthcare proposal in this dynamic?
Well, yes, it was. Yes, of course, that any defeat is going to both. It had politically, it along with NAFTA, it set the stage for the big Republican victory in '94. And it's a defeat. I mean, and the enemies of the plan and of Clinton, cast it. Oh, this is an example of big government. That effort that failed, and rightly so. So vote against Clinton, and the '94 elections were a disaster. NAFTA, I think, was probably more important. Clinton's support of NAFTA in '93 and '4. I think was a blunder. And I use that word blunder, which implies he didn't have to have done it. It was a George H.W. Bush initiative. It was also supported by certain elites in Mexico. And there was a big debate inside the Clinton administration. He didn't have to do it. I think one reason he did it was that he did pass a budget in '93, which did raise taxes on the rich. There's no doubt about it. It also and cut the defense budget for that matter. But I call it an austerity budget because none of Robert Reich's ideas were in it. It didn't expand the welfare state or guide new investment. But nevertheless, he did win that budget against complete universal Republican opposition. So Clinton thought, I need a bipartisan victory here. And NAFTA, that'll be a bipartisan. And it was, but that was a disastrous. It was bipartisan. Republicans supported it, but half the Democratic Party was against it. Clinton was a terrible party leader. He split the party over and over and over again on trade and welfare issues. So '94 was a big disaster.
This is known as the third way.
Well, we'll get to that a little later. The third way is not a phrase used in the first half of the Clinton administration. The third way comes in when Tony Blair wins a big victory, first as head of the Labor Party in '96, and then in '97 he wins a huge majority in Parliament, and he uses the term third way to distinguish himself against the old Labor Party. And the Clintonites, who are who've lost their majority in Congress, they did win re-election, but that's great. We'll glom onto that third way, and it's in '97 that the phrase third way is adopted. It's sort of Blair, Clinton, and then maybe some of the German social democrats who had rejected Marxism, and that's when it comes into the play. And subsequently, historians or journalists have applied it to the entire Clinton administration, but it only really came into play in '97.
With NAFTA, this is also an element of the state of labor and unions
Well,
being at a
yes,
low
yes,
point.
yes, absolutely. Labor, I think, was properly against NAFTA. I mean, NAFTA was one of the big issues in NAFTA at that time and subsequently was, you know, are you going to have genuine trade unions in Mexico? Is there anything that's going to, in NAFTA that's going to open the door to genuine independent Mexican trade unions? That was a big negotiating thing. The Clintonites kind of tepidly tried to do that, but they didn't succeed. The Mexican government, we have to actually give a little bit of negative play to the Mexican government, which was a kind of authoritarian operation, and they were militantly against independent trade unions. The party of PRI, Party of Revolutionary Institutions, they were hostile to that, and they saw that as an absolute invasion of a Mexican sovereignty. Well, it would have been, but it was an invasion of an authoritarian polity. Anyway, labor was against it, and a big slice of the Democratic Party. And Lane Kirkland went to Clinton in like September of 1993 and said, "Look, we got $5 million here to use in advertising. We can either use it to support your health care plan, or we can use it to fight NAFTA. Which one? Which one? Choose." And the fact that the Clintonites went ahead with NAFTA at the same time as the healthcare plan, well, the AFL-CIO put their $5 million against NAFTA, not in favor of the healthcare plan.
So it had to be one, or they had to be one or the other, though. That's interesting.
Yeah, they had $5 million. Yeah, I mean, I guess they could have split it, but they they put it against NAFTA. The NAFTA was toxic. It was toxic for the obvious sort of racial immigration, kind of issues. Mexico is right on the doorstep of America, and one of the features of NAFTA was that American agricultural products produced in efficient California and Texas would flood into Mexico, and that would dispossess millions of Mexican peasants who would then end up on the border. It was toxic, but overall, in terms of jobs, NAFTA it probably didn't have. It had some impact, but not enormous. I mean, Ross Perot was probably wrong about giant sucking sound vis-a-vis Mexico. China was another story. China was much, much bigger and much more consequential than NAFTA, but it didn't have quite the racial, cultural immigrant, oomph that NAFTA did.
It's with
NAFTA was toxic.
It's with bringing China into the WTOs when we get the Battle of Seattle.
That would be very consencial.
And this is with the Battle of Seattle.
Yeah, right. That was a kind of part of the politicization of that. That was late 1999. And there have been a lot of negotiations with China. Part of the key thing about China was Wall Street, and Rubin came out of Goldman Sachs, and he represented Wall Street to a degree in the administration. Wall Street they didn't care about trade with China. What they wanted was to invest and to capitalize these giant Chinese state-owned enterprises and sell their stock on Wall Street. So the largest telecom company in the world was China Telecom, which was capitalized by a consortium of American investment banks. That's what they really wanted to do. And there were some, when China did enter the WTO, some of the Clintonites, we're going to sell all sorts of stuff to China and get cheap stuff from there. I mean, we never sold anything to China. We invested stuff in China, and Wall Street made a lot of money privatizing those state-owned enterprises. And that was the crucial thing. And at one point, Rubin actually delays China's entry into WTO because he didn't think Wall Street had quite enough access to these big state-owned enterprises in China. But ultimately that's what he wanted. Rubin was, again, a believer in capital mobility and free trade. Those were absolutely foundational to him, and to that whole wing of the Clinton administration.
But you also said he wasn't vehemently opposed to a welfare state, and yet we end up
Right.
getting
Yeah.
welfare
See, I want
reform.
to make
But
that
yet
clear
we get
about
welfare
neoliberalism.
reform. So where does welfare reform come
Right.
from?
Neoliberalism if that has any meaning, does not mean slashing welfare states just for the purpose of slashing them. I mean, that may be the result of it because you don't have because you aren't raising taxes, et cetera. But the essence of it is capital mobility around the world, and deregulation of finance. That's the essence of it, and that took priority over anything else from Rubin's point of view. Yes, he was in favor. Again, he was in favor of the welfare state, but he was also in favor of balanced budgets where you're not going to have any money for the welfare state. So actually, when Clinton does put forward the welfare reform, which didn't really cost much money, or actually, in 1996, which was very unpopular because it really was a repudiation of an important element of the New Deal, and also, of course, had a very strong racial component to it. It was, against welfare mothers, which was another phrase for African American women. Anyway, Rubin says, I mean, in a meeting, he says, well, we shouldn't do it. Capitalism doesn't always work for everybody. Some people are victims. And he recognized that. So, but I mean, it wasn't like he fought against it. That was his view. I was surprised to read that myself. And but he was against it. So, but Clinton put it forward because by 1996, he was convinced that welfare reform, I mean, whether or not it was going to generate jobs or not is another story, but he saw it as a cultural, political point. Doing welfare reform is going to accommodate all these culturally conservative people and help him win the election. At least that's what his handlers told him. I don't think it was necessary at all in terms of even those stark political terms, and certainly as it became very, very controversial then because it seemed to be Clinton is repudiating the New Deal. I mean, that's one of the items in the checklist that makes Clinton, a bad guy, a neoliberal. Was welfare reform,
and also and repealing the Glass-Steagall Act, which put sort of a
right,
wall between investment bankers and traditional bankers.
Let me say, and like many of the Clinton initiatives, it started off more progressive, and then it's sliced and diced and becomes more. So Clinton's favorite social scientist is William Julius Wilson, who's an African-American sociologist, who's a lefty, a kind of a lefty, because he emphasizes we need to reindustrialize the ghetto, and work is important to social stability. And he makes those points. Well, Clinton references that all the time. But by the time the welfare reform, gets going, gets signed, he signs it, it's been stripped of most of those progressive aspects, and it's just a kind of penalizes people who don't work. That's all. Now on Glass-Steagall, you mentioned that. Glass-Steagall was sort of which what Glass-Steagall does is it separated investment banking from commercial banking. Commercial banks just loan money to other companies to build factories and things. Investment banks helped issue stock and were much more engaged in financial manipulations. It had from the 30s, those have been divided. And then by the 1980s, late 80s, it's being eroded in various ways. The Federal Reserve, especially under Greenspan, is eroding Glass-Steagall and allowing commercial banks to engage in some investment banking activities and whatnot. It finally is ultimately repealed formally in, I think it's 1999. It was symbolic of the deregulation of finance, which Clinton went along with. Now, they used a kind of, by that point, late 90s, innovative society, Silicon Valley, this is going to, generate a new era of innovation and energy. That was part of the kind of the ideological argument that Clinton clearly was part of by that point, and Rubin and Summers and others did as well. I think more important than the Glass-Steagall Act the repeal of Glass-Steagall was the deregulation of derivatives, and there was a really big fight inside the administration over the deregulation. They could see this was kind of a monster coming along, kind of a world of absolute chaotic speculation, and there were people against it. But it was pushed through. It was just pushed through in 99, I think 2000, it was finally signed.
Tell me more about both the Federal Reserve led by Alan Greenspan at the time, and also the Treasury Department. And again, we've talked a lot about Robert Rubin, but talk to me about these departments, their roles. Are these departments working sort of hand in glove with Clinton? Are they more independent?
Right. Well, yes. And I'm glad you mentioned those two, that a presidential administration, a president needs not just himself, but he needs a kind of institutions that will support his programs. So repeatedly, both of those, the Fed and the Treasury, were kind of independent of Clinton, of what Clinton wanted. When it came to the Treasury, Democratic presidents always have felt they have to appoint Wall Streeters to kind of reassure the market. And then, of course, the Fed is in the part of the same way and is independent. It sets interest rates totally independent of what the White House wants. So Clinton would have all these progressive impulses. When it came to corporate responsibility or CEO salaries, or he would jot on a memo or a page, oh, can't we do something about this? And then it would go to like the Treasury, and then 3 days later it'd be a 5-page memo, single-space memo, basically saying no, written by five economists, and so Clinton, it sort of happened to Trump. Trump would have some thing he wanted to do, and then back from the bureaucracy, the deep state, would come this opposition. Well, with Clinton, that happened all the time, and then the Fed. Greenspan was just independent. Now, Greenspan, interesting on the Fed, and here we get to labor. Greenspan does not raise interest rates in the second half of the 90s. Employment was high, unemployment was low. There were those who thought, oh, inflation's on the horizon, like today, hey, maybe we should raise interest rates to staunch that. Greenspan doesn't do it. He's an Ayn Rand conservative, but he doesn't do it for two reasons. One, he also thinks, like Clinton and others, we have a new economy and it's more productive. Silicon Valley is making everything more productive, and he thinks that's true, and that may have been true for a moment. The second thing, though, and I think more important, is Greenspan has a theory of the working class. He thinks that after Patco and after the recessions of the 80s, the working class is traumatized. That's the word he uses, traumatized, meaning it's fearful. And there were big layoffs in the mid and early and mid 90s. And so at one point after the UPS strike of 1997, there was a very successful strike then. And they had a discussion on the Fed, hey, is the era of the traumatized worker, of the fearful worker, over? And they discussing this. And, oh, Patco, what a great thing Patco was, the feet of the working class. It means that workers are not aggressive.
What was Patco? You mentioned it a couple of times. What was Patco?
Patco was Ronald Reagan's destruction of the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Union in 1981, and that set the stage for a capitalist offensive against labor that lasted for decades. And so they're having this debate on the Fed about the consciousness of American workers. I thought that was kind of interesting, and ultimately it turned out no, the UPS strike of 1997, which was a victory, didn't have the ripple effect that they feared. I was in favor of ripple effect, but it didn't have what they feared. And so Greenspan keeps interest rates low during the late 90s, which creates a kind of bubble in the stock market and for a moment low unemployment.
And which would lead to several bubbles crashing
Yeah,
from.
I should say one thing that Clinton tried to replace Greenspan. He knew Greenspan was not on his team, although he tried to replace him with others who were more of a Keynesian mentality and policy. But he failed because Greenspan had this enormous support on Wall Street and Congress, and also within his own administration. The Reuben Summers Treasury Department was basically worked very closely with Greenspan and wanted him to stay. So Clinton, you can see the limitations of Clinton as simply the structures are in opposition to his sort of progressive impulses, and then they of course just fade away. The latter just is nothing.
It does seem like, though, it's important to underline, you've mentioned it, just the lack of a strong left movement in the country at the time during the
Yes,
Clinton presidency.
absolutely. And again, the labor movement is both weak, institutionally, and ideologically it has very little appeal. Certainly under Lane Kirkland. Later on, under Sweeney, actually the Clinton people kind of welcomed John Sweeney, who takes over the AFL-CIO in 96, I think it is. They welcome that. They're looking for a left, and you find in the oral histories and people like George Stephanopoulos and even Clinton himself would say, "Gee, I wish I had more pressure from the left," all these the businessmen and whatnot are running the show. I wish there was more pressure, but I mean they didn't help create it, but nevertheless it wasn't there. And so they welcomed Sweeney, not that it had much impact on American policy, but they thought maybe this is the revitalization. It didn't really happen, but at that time. But today, Biden clearly, he I think he finds the what's going on in the American labor movement probably on the whole helpful to his policies.
How much connection is there from the Biden administration to the Clinton administration? I mean, obviously these are over 20 years apart, but
I think Biden learns some things from Clinton. One thing he learns, and I mean Trump helped make this clear, is let's forget about balanced budgets. Let's just forget about that. That's not important. And even Robert Rubin would admit in his memoirs that balancing the budget was not the key to economic confidence or low interest rates. Let's forget about that. And so there are gigantic stimulus programs put forward first under Trump and then under Biden, and they weren't worrying whatsoever about the balanced budget. So that was an important thing they learned, from Clinton and also from Obama to a degree. And austerity is just a big mistake. It's not going to generate the business confidence that Rubin thought was so essential. And in fact, the Biden recovery from the pandemic was much, much more rapid than that than what happened under Obama. So that's it. And then, of course, also Biden has, realized that simply allowing American capitalists to invest wherever they damn well please, whether it's abroad or in the speculative bubbles or what have you, is just not the key to revitalization of American industry and the growth of good jobs. And so there is a de facto industrial policy under Biden, which is not exactly what the progressives in the Clinton administration wanted, but it resembles it, and he's doing it, in a much more vigorous and big fashion. Now, Biden himself was a centrist Democrat back in the 90s. He was, but times change. Certain ideas become more forceful. Robert Reich moved to the left, left, and others. Influence of Bernie cannot be discounted, and so Biden is in some ways putting forth some of the policies of the Clinton left or the Clinton progressives in that early period of his administration.
And yet he did allow, and maybe he couldn't have stopped on his own, but didn't put up a big fight to expand some of these pandemic measures that did reduce poverty. And now we're seeing reports that poverty, especially childhood poverty, is back up.
Yeah, whether he should have fought harder or whatnot. I mean, yes, he had a very slim majority, and whether it's Manchin's fault or Biden didn't fight hard enough or whatnot. Yes, unfortunately, many of the welfare state provisions, sort of the COVID the COVID welfare state, were stripped out, and that is a tragedy and a mistake, and maybe we'll have terrible political consequences, because it's right now and for the next year that these programs are being dismantled. That's true. Although on the other hand, the Investment Act and the Inflation Reduction Act and the chips, this is all industrial policy. So that, and then I do think, by the way, in the current auto strike, I think that there is a kind of parallelism between what the UAW wants, high wages and a green transition in the battery plants, and Biden's program to reindustrialize the Midwest. I mean, the Clinton program, although most of the destruction of factories took place under Bush, but it really was the Clinton program opening to China that destroyed somewhere upwards of 5 million factory jobs. Well, Biden's trying to reverse that. Oh, and of course on trade, Biden has moved toward a kind of more managed trade posture, which is again what some of those among progressives in the early Clinton administration wanted.
Nelson Lichtenstein has been our guest. He has joined us for a conversation about his book called A Fabulous Failure, The Clinton Presidency and the Transformation of American Capitalism, written with the late Judith Stein. Nelson Lichtenstein, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you indeed.